She saved a duke from a runaway carriage. Next morning, 10 horses stopped at her door. The Duke of Ashford was 3 seconds from death when Eliza Hartley threw herself into the path of the runaway carriage, grabbed the spooked horses' harnesses, and used every ounce of strength in her blacksmith's daughter body to wrench them away from the aristocrat frozen in the middle of Cheapside. She felt her shoulder dislocate with a sickening pop as the horses screamed and veered, their massive bodies barely missing the Duke's expensively tailored form. The carriage careened past him, close enough that his hair whipped in the wind of its passage, and Eliza went down hard beneath thrashing hooves and snapping leather. Pain exploded through her ribs, her leg, her skull as it cracked against cobblestone. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the Duke's face, beautiful, aristocratic, absolutely horrified, staring down at her while she bled into the London street, knowing she would probably die, but strangely content that she'd saved him anyway. When she woke 30 hours later in a bed softer than clouds, surrounded by cream silk and morning light, she thought she had died after all, and somehow ended up in a heaven that smelled of expensive cologne and beeswax candles. Then the Duke walked in, and she realized heaven was far more complicated than she'd imagined. Wait, before the next confession unfolds. If this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now back to the scene. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, and his voice was like dark honey, smooth and rich and dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "Thank God. The physician said you might not wake at all, that the head injury was severe enough to—" He stopped himself, visibly collecting his composure. "I'm grateful to see them proven wrong." Eliza tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through her entire body. She fell back against the pillows with a gasp. "Don't move," the Duke commanded, moving to her bedside with swift grace. "You have 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder that's been reset, a fractured leg, and a concussion severe enough that the doctors have been monitoring you constantly. You're lucky to be alive." "Where am I?" Eliza's voice came out as a croak. Her throat was desert dry. "Ashford House, my London residence." He poured water from a crystal pitcher into a glass and held it to her lips with surprising gentleness. "I had you brought here immediately after the accident. You saved my life, Miss Hartley. The least I could do was ensure you received the finest medical care available." The water was cool and perfect. Eliza drank gratefully, then managed, "You know my name." "I made inquiries. You're Eliza Hartley, daughter of Thomas Hartley, master blacksmith of Southwark. You're 23 years old, unmarried, and you work in your father's forge alongside him. Quite scandalously, according to my sources, as blacksmithing is not considered appropriate work for young ladies." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Though I suppose someone with the strength to redirect 2 panicked carriage horses is precisely the sort of woman who would ignore conventions about appropriate work." Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. The Duke was looking at her as though she were a puzzle he was trying to solve, his dark blue eyes intent and disconcertingly focused. "You're Alexander Grayson," she said, "Duke of Ashford. I recognized you from the broadsheets." She paused, then added, "You're younger than I expected, and less pompous-looking." The Duke's smile widened into something genuine. "I'm 31, Miss Hartley, and I try to keep the pompous-looking to formal occasions only. It's exhausting to maintain constantly." Despite the pain racking her body, Eliza found herself smiling back. "How long have I been here?" 30 hours, as I said. This is the 2nd morning since the accident." He settled into a chair beside the bed, as though he'd been keeping vigil there regularly. "Your father has been notified. I sent a carriage for him yesterday, but he was occupied with essential work for the Royal Artillery and couldn't leave immediately. He'll arrive this afternoon." "You sent a carriage for my father?" Eliza tried to process this. Dukes did not send carriages for common blacksmiths. Dukes did not house injured common women in their London residences. Dukes did not sit at bedsides looking at blacksmiths' daughters as though they mattered. "Of course, you were injured saving my life. The least I can do is ensure your family knows you're being cared for." Alexander, and she found herself thinking of him by his Christian name, which was wildly inappropriate, leaned forward slightly. "Miss Hartley, I need you to understand something. You stepped in front of a runaway carriage to save a complete stranger. You could have been killed. You nearly were killed. That's not merely bravery. That's the kind of selfless courage that defies explanation." "You were in danger," Eliza said simply. "I had the strength to help. It would have been wrong to stand by and watch you die when I could do something." Most people would have done exactly that, stood by and watched. Self-preservation is a powerful instinct. His eyes held hers. Why didn't you? Eliza considered the question. Why hadn't she? In the moment, there had been no thought, no calculation of risk or benefit. She'd simply seen another human being about to die and known she had the physical capability to prevent it. "Because life is precious," she said finally. "Rich or poor, duke or blacksmith, every life has value. Yours wasn't worth less than mine just because you were born with a title. It wasn't worth more either. It was simply a life that needed saving, and I could save it." Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something complicated and intense flickering across his aristocratic face. "You're extraordinary, Miss Hartley. Absolutely extraordinary." "I'm really not. I just have strong arms from working the forge, and a father who taught me that courage means acting when action is needed, not when it's convenient." Eliza shifted slightly, trying to find a position that hurt less. "Your Grace, I appreciate the medical care, but I should return home as soon as I'm able to be moved. It's too much. You've done more than enough already." "I disagree." Alexander's voice was firm. "You'll remain here until the physicians clear you for travel, and even then—" He paused, seeming to make a decision. "Miss Hartley, I owe you a debt that cannot be repaid through medical care alone. I would like to do something more substantial to express my gratitude." Eliza felt unease stir beneath her exhaustion. "That's not necessary, Your Grace, truly. I didn't save you expecting compensation." "I know you didn't. That's precisely why you deserve it." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked what must be an enormous garden. "My estate manager will be reaching out to your father about opportunities to expand his business. And I would like to establish a fund for you, something that would provide independence and security." No, the word came out sharper than Eliza intended. "Your Grace, I appreciate the thought, but I can't accept money from you. It would be— people would—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate how taking money from an unmarried duke would make her look like his mistress, would tarnish her reputation beyond repair. Alexander turned from the window, understanding evident in his eyes. "You're worried about appearances. I'm worried about reality. A common woman accepting substantial money from an unmarried duke? Society would assume I'm being compensated for services that have nothing to do with saving your life." Eliza met his gaze steadily. "I have very little, Your Grace, but I have my reputation and my self-respect. I won't trade those for financial security, no matter how well-intentioned the offer." "Then what can I do?" The question emerged with genuine frustration. "How can I possibly thank you for saving my life when you won't accept anything material?" "You already have thanked me. You've provided excellent medical care. You've informed my father, and you've treated me with kindness and respect, despite the difference in our stations. That's more than enough. It's nowhere near enough, Alexander said quietly. But I'll respect your wishes, Miss Hartley, for now. The emphasis on those last two words suggested the matter was far from settled. But before Eliza could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of an elderly physician who proceeded to examine her injuries with professional efficiency. Alexander excused himself, but as he left, he glanced back at Eliza with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between admiration and determination, and something else that made her heart beat faster despite her best efforts at rationality. She was in dangerous territory, she realized, not just physically broken from the accident, but emotionally vulnerable to a man who existed in an entirely different world from her own. Nothing good could come from a blacksmith's daughter entertaining impossible thoughts about a duke. She needed to heal and return home before her foolish heart forgot that fundamental truth. Thomas Hartley arrived that afternoon, a bear of a man with hands scarred from decades of forge work and eyes that went suspiciously bright when he saw his daughter alive and reasonably whole. "Eliza, girl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When they told me what you'd done, I didn't know whether to be proud or furious. Throwing yourself at runaway horses, that's madness, that is." "It worked, though," Eliza pointed out. "The Duke's alive." "And you're broken to pieces," her father said carefully on the edge of the bed, taking her hand in his work-roughened one. "But I am proud, lass. Terrified for you, but proud. You did what needed doing. Consequences be damned. That's the Hartley way." They talked for an hour, about the forge, about the commissions her father was juggling in her absence, about the neighbors who'd been asking after her. It was comfortable and familiar, and exactly what Eliza needed to feel grounded after the strangeness of waking in a duke's house. Then Alexander appeared in the doorway, and the temperature of the room seemed to shift. "Mr. Hartley," the Duke said, his aristocratic bearing on full display, "thank you for coming. I wanted to speak with you about your daughter's care and recovery." Thomas stood, and Eliza saw him unconsciously straighten his spine, meeting the Duke's eyes directly despite the vast difference in their social positions. "Your Grace, I'm grateful for what you've done for Eliza. The physician said she's had the best care possible. She saved my life, Mr. Hartley. Providing excellent medical care is the absolute minimum I owe her." Alexander moved into the room with the unconscious grace of someone who'd never doubted his right to occupy any space he chose. "I wanted to discuss her recovery. The physicians say she'll need several weeks of rest before she can return to normal activities. I'd like her to remain here at Ashford House during that time." "That's generous, Your Grace, but not necessary," Thomas said carefully. "I can care for her at home, while also managing your forge and fulfilling your contracts with the Royal Artillery." Alexander's tone was polite but pointed. "Mr. Hartley, your work is essential."
The war effort depends on skilled blacksmiths like yourself. Taking time away to nurse your daughter would impact production at exactly the time when cannon and weaponry are most needed. It was a clever argument, Eliza realized. Appeal to Thomas Hartley's patriotism and sense of duty while making the Duke's offer seem practical rather than charitable. Her father's expression suggested he recognized the manipulation but was reluctantly persuaded nonetheless. Eliza should have a say in this. It's her recovery we're discussing. Both men turned to look at her. Eliza felt the weight of their attention and the complexity of the choice she was being asked to make. Stay here, in luxury and comfort under the Duke's care and scrutiny, or return home to the cramped room above the forge where her father would exhaust himself trying to work and care for her simultaneously. "I'll stay," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "If it's not too much imposition, Your Grace, just until I can walk without assistance." "No imposition at all," Alexander said, and the warmth in his voice made Eliza's traitorous heart skip. "You're welcome here for as long as you need." Thomas nodded slowly, then fixed the Duke with a look that was pure protective father. "Your Grace, my daughter is a good girl, respectable and hard-working. I trust she'll be treated as such during her stay here. Mr. Hartley, I give you my word as a gentleman that Miss Hartley will be treated with the utmost respect and propriety," Alexander said, his voice carrying absolute sincerity. "She will have her own rooms, a maid assigned to her care, and complete privacy. My household staff has been instructed to ensure her comfort and dignity at all times." "See that they do," Thomas said bluntly. "Duke or not, you'll answer to me if any harm comes to her." Instead of being offended by the impertinence, Alexander smiled. "I would expect nothing less from a father who raised a daughter brave enough to face down runaway horses. Your daughter is safe here, Mr. Hartley. You have my solemn promise." After Thomas left, with many backward glances and whispered reassurances to Eliza, she found herself alone with her thoughts and the profound strangeness of her situation. She was in a duke's house, being cared for by his servants, under his protection, and, if she was being honest with herself, under his increasingly intent scrutiny. Alexander visited her room 3 more times that day, once to ensure she'd eaten dinner, once to introduce the night nurse who would monitor her condition, and once simply to sit in the chair by her bed and read aloud from a book of poetry until her eyelids grew heavy. "Why are you doing this?" she asked as sleep began to claim her. "I know you said you're grateful, but this, sitting here reading to me, that's not normal ducal behavior, is it?" Alexander set the book aside and regarded her with those unsettling blue eyes. "No, Miss Hartley, it's not normal ducal behavior at all. But then, you're not a normal patient, and I find I'm not particularly interested in behaving normally around you. That's dangerous talk, Your Grace." "Perhaps." He stood, but before leaving, he said quietly, "Or perhaps the dangerous thing would be pretending I don't find you absolutely fascinating. Sleep well, Eliza." He used her Christian name. The intimacy of it sent warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with impossibilities she couldn't let herself imagine. She fell asleep trying not to think about the way he'd looked at her, the way his voice had wrapped around her name like a caress, the way her entire world had tilted on its axis the moment she'd thrown herself between him and death. The next morning, Eliza woke to the sound of horses, not just 1 or 2, but many. She struggled to sit up despite her injuries, driven by curiosity she couldn't suppress. The maid assigned to her care, a sweet girl named Mary, hurried to help her to the window. "Oh, miss," Mary breathed, "it's magnificent." Below, in the circular drive of Ashford House, stood 10 horses. Not carriage horses or ordinary riding stock, but magnificent creatures. Bays and chestnuts, and one stunning black stallion, all of them groomed to perfection. All of them standing calm and regal, as though they knew they were being presented. And beside them stood Alexander, looking up at her window with an expression that was equal parts sheepish and determined. "What is this?" Eliza called down, her voice carrying in the morning air. "These are the horses from the runaway carriage that nearly killed me," Alexander called back, "plus 8 more from my stable. They're yours, Miss Hartley, a gift." "I can't accept 10 horses." "They're not a gift of money, they're simply horses. And you quite literally saved me from them, so it seems only fitting that you should have them." His smile was wicked and charming. "Besides, your father is a blacksmith. Surely horses could be useful in that trade." Eliza wanted to argue. She wanted to refuse this ridiculous, extravagant, absolutely inappropriate gift.
But looking at the horses, at the stunning animals standing proud and perfect in the morning sun, she found herself fighting a smile. "You're mad," she called down. "Quite possibly," Alexander agreed. "But you're stuck with me now, Miss Hartley. You saved my life, and I'm afraid that means I'm going to be impossibly stubborn about repaying the debt." The household staff who had gathered to watch the spectacle were clearly trying not to laugh. Even Mary beside Eliza was grinning. "This is highly irregular," Eliza said, but her protest sounded weak even to her own ears. "I'm discovering I quite enjoy irregular," Alexander said, "especially when irregular involves you." He was flirting with her, in front of his entire staff, in broad daylight, with 10 horses as props. A duke was flirting with a blacksmith's daughter, and Eliza had no earthly idea how to respond. "I'll need to discuss this with my father," she said finally. "Horses are expensive to maintain. We may not have the resources." "All expenses related to their care will be covered by the Ashford estate," Alexander interrupted. "Feed, tack, stable space if needed, everything. They're yours free and clear, Miss Hartley. You need only accept them." "Why?" The question emerged as more of a plea than she intended. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, "Because you deserve beautiful things, Eliza, and because I want to give them to you." The use of her Christian name again, in front of everyone, was a statement in itself. He was claiming some form of intimacy, some connection between them that transcended normal social boundaries. It should have scandalized her, should have sent her into proper protests about reputation and propriety. Instead, it made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced before. "I accept," she said quietly, "the horses. I accept them. And thank you, Alexander." His smile, when it came, was brilliant enough to rival the morning sun. Over the following weeks, as Eliza healed and grew stronger, a peculiar routine established itself at Ashford House. Alexander would visit her rooms each morning, always properly, with Mary present as chaperone, and they would talk about everything and nothing, about her work in the forge and his responsibilities as Duke, about books and politics and the strange state of England at war. He was brilliant, Eliza discovered, sharp-witted and well-read, with opinions that often challenged conventional aristocratic thinking. He cared about his tenants and his responsibilities, but he also chafed against the restrictions of his position. "Sometimes I think I was born into the wrong life," he admitted one morning as they sat in the garden where Eliza had been allowed to walk short distances with assistance. "I have power and wealth and influence, but I'm trapped by expectations and propriety. I can't simply do what I want. Every action is scrutinized, every choice measured against what's appropriate for my station."
"And what would you do?"
Eliza asked, "if you could live without those constraints." "I don't know," Alexander said honestly, "but I think I'd like to find out. I think I'd like to make choices based on what I want rather than what's expected of me."
"That's a luxury most people don't have," Eliza pointed out gently. "The luxury of choice, I mean. Most of us are simply trying to survive."
"I know, and I'm not complaining, truly. I'm aware of my privilege." He turned to face her more fully. "But talking with you has made me realize how much of my life has been performance, playing the role of Duke rather than being myself."
"And who is yourself, without the title?"
Alexander considered the question. "I think I'm someone who values genuine connection over social advantage, someone who would rather spend an afternoon talking with a fascinating woman than attending another tedious ball. Someone who finds courage more attractive than careful propriety."
The way he looked at her when he said fascinating woman made Eliza's breath catch. They were treading dangerous territory, and they both knew it.
"Alexander," she said carefully, "we both know this.
Whatever this is can't go anywhere. You're a duke. I'm a blacksmith's daughter. The world doesn't allow for that kind of crossing of boundaries.
The world doesn't allow for a lot of things, Alexander said. It didn't allow for a woman to throw herself at runaway horses to save a stranger's life, but you did it anyway. It doesn't allow for common women to work forges alongside their fathers, but you've done that since you were old enough to hold a hammer.
Why should we let the world's limitations dictate what we can or cannot feel? Because feelings aren't enough, Eliza said, hating the truth of it. You need an heir. You need to marry someone appropriate, a lady of quality who can navigate society and provide legitimate children to continue your line. I can't give you any of that. What if I don't want any of that? Alexander's voice was low, intense. What if what I want is sitting right here, arguing with me about impossibilities while recovering from injuries saving my life? Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. Please don't say things like that. Don't make me hope for something that would destroy us both if we pursued it. Why would it destroy us? Because society would never accept me as your duchess. Because I would always be the blacksmith's daughter who trapped a duke through manipulation or seduction or whatever story they decided to tell. Because your family and peers would make both our lives miserable, trying to separate us or force me to conform to standards I was never raised to meet. Eliza blinked back tears. And because eventually you would resent me for it. For being the reason you couldn't fulfill your responsibilities, for being the scandal attached to your name, for not being what a duke's wife should be. You're wrong, Alexander said fiercely. I would never resent you, Eliza. I would be proud to stand beside you, regardless of what society thought. You say that now, in the flush of gratitude and whatever feelings you think you have. But in 5 years, 10, when your peers have ostracized you and your family has turned their backs and every door in society is closed to you because of me? Eliza shook her head. I care about you too much to let that happen. The admission hung in the air between them. The first time either had explicitly acknowledged that feelings existed beyond gratitude and fascination. You care about me, Alexander repeated softly. Of course I care about you. You're brilliant and kind, and you make me laugh even when I'm in pain. You've treated me with more respect and genuine interest than anyone outside my family ever has. How could I not care about you? Eliza met his eyes. But caring isn't enough to bridge the chasm between a duke and a blacksmith's daughter, and pretending otherwise is cruelty to us both. Alexander reached out and took her hand, a breach of propriety, even with Mary studiously pretending not to notice from her position several feet away. What if we didn't have to pretend? What if there was a way to make this work? There isn't. You know there isn't. Then I'll find one, Alexander said with absolute conviction. Because I'm not giving up on this, Eliza. I'm not giving up on you. You saved my life. The least I can do is fight for a chance at having you in it. Before Eliza could respond, Mary cleared her throat pointedly. Begging your pardon, Your Grace, Miss Hartley, but the physician is here for Miss Hartley's examination. The moment shattered. Alexander released Eliza's hand and stood, his expression shifting back into the controlled mask of ducal propriety. Of course, he said. I'll return this evening, Miss Hartley, if you're feeling up to visitors. I'd like that, Eliza said quietly. After he left, Mary helped her back inside while chattering about the household gossip. But Eliza barely heard her. Her mind was spinning with Alexander's declaration, with the impossibility of what he seemed to want, with her own treacherous hope that maybe, somehow, there could be a way. But hope was dangerous. Hope led to heartbreak. And Eliza had a terrible suspicion she was already too far gone to protect herself from either. That evening, Alexander didn't come alone. He arrived with an elderly woman in tow, elegant, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that spoke of aristocracy and absolute confidence. Miss Hartley, Alexander said, his expression carefully neutral. "I'd like you to meet my aunt, Lady Margaret Thornton. She's my mother's sister and has been, well, she's been quite curious about the woman who saved my life." Lady Margaret swept into the room with the command of someone who had navigated highest society for decades, but when she looked at Eliza, her eyes were kind. "Miss Hartley, my nephew has spoken of little else but you for 2 weeks. I decided I needed to meet this paragon who has so thoroughly captured his attention." Eliza felt heat flood her cheeks. "Your ladyship, I'm hardly a paragon, just someone who happened to be in the right place to help." "Nonsense. Alexander tells me you work in your father's forge, that you have the strength to control panicked carriage horses, and that you've been arguing with him about accepting appropriate gratitude for saving his life." Lady Margaret settled into a chair with graceful ease. "That sounds rather like a paragon to me, or at least someone refreshingly unconventional. Aunt Margaret is one of the few people whose opinions I genuinely value," Alexander said, taking his usual chair beside Eliza's chaise. "And she's one of the even fewer people who doesn't care about society's expectations when they conflict with common sense. I'm old enough and wealthy enough to say what I think," Lady Margaret said with a smile. "It's one of the few advantages of being a widow past 60. The censure of society holds no terror when you've already survived 5 decades of it." Eliza found herself relaxing slightly. There was something genuine about Lady Margaret, something that suggested she wasn't here merely to inspect the common woman who had presumed to save a duke. "Miss Hartley," Lady Margaret said, after they'd chatted for several minutes about inconsequential things, "I'm going to be frank with you, because frankness is efficient, and I suspect you appreciate efficiency. My nephew is infatuated with you. It's obvious to anyone with eyes. And from what I observe, the feeling is at least somewhat mutual." "Aunt Margaret," Alexander began, but his aunt waved him to silence. "Hush, dear, I'm trying to help." She turned her attention back to Eliza. "Now, this infatuation poses certain problems. Alexander is a duke. You are not of his social class. A marriage between you would cause significant scandal and likely result in social ostracism for you both." "I'm aware of that, your ladyship," Eliza said quietly. "I'm sure you are. You strike me as sensible." Lady Margaret leaned forward slightly. "But here's what I've learned in my 63 years. Society's rules exist to maintain power structures and protect wealth. They have very little to do with actual morality or human happiness. And while I understand the practical concerns you must have, I want you to know that not everyone in our family would oppose such a match." Eliza stared at her. "I'm sorry, what?" "If Alexander chooses to pursue a relationship with you, if he decides that happiness with someone he genuinely cares for is worth more than society's approval, he would have my support, financial, social, and otherwise." Lady Margaret's smile was sharp. "I'm quite wealthy in my own right, Miss Hartley, with properties and connections that don't depend on ton approval. And I've spent my entire life watching people sacrifice happiness for propriety. I'm rather tired of it." "Aunt Margaret, you don't need to," Alexander tried again. "I absolutely do need to, because you're both so busy being noble and self-sacrificing that you're going to talk yourselves out of something potentially wonderful." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "I'm not saying you should rush into anything. I'm simply saying that the obstacles you're imagining might not be as insurmountable as you think, particularly if you have allies with resources and a willingness to thumb their noses at society on your behalf." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Miss Hartley? My nephew is stubborn as a mule when he wants something. He gets it from his mother's side of the family. If he's decided he wants you in his life, he's not going to give up easily. You might want to prepare yourself for that." After she swept out, leaving a stunned silence in her wake, Eliza turned to Alexander. "Is your entire family this direct?"
Only the ones I like, Alexander said, his lips twitching with suppressed laughter. My Aunt Margaret has been a force of nature for as long as I've known her. But she's right about one thing. I'm not giving up on this. On us. There is no us, Alexander. There can't be. Why not? My aunt just offered her support. She has significant influence in her own right, enough that her backing would protect us from the worst of society's censure. And what about your responsibility to produce an heir, to continue your family line with legitimate children? Eliza asked. I may not be a lady, but I'm not ignorant of how aristocracy works. I have a brother, Alexander said. Richard is next in line after me. If I chose not to marry, or to marry someone who couldn't produce heirs, which is not the case with you, but for the sake of argument, the succession would pass to him and his eventual children. The title would be secure. You're making it sound so simple. I'm making it sound possible, which is different from simple. Alexander moved to sit beside her on the chaise, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Eliza, I'm not naive. I know this would be difficult. I know we'd face opposition and scandal and all manner of problems. But I also know that in 31 years of life, I've never met anyone who makes me feel the way you do. And I'm not willing to let that go without at least trying to see if we could build something together. What way? Eliza asked softly. How do I make you feel? Alive, Alexander said simply. Genuinely alive. Not just going through the motions of living. When I'm with you, I'm not the Duke of Ashford with all the responsibilities and expectations that entails. I'm just Alexander, talking to someone who sees me as a person rather than a title. You challenge me. You make me laugh. You make me think about what I want from life rather than what others want from me. And yes, you quite literally saved my life, which seems like a sign I should probably pay attention to. Eliza felt her resolve wavering. Everything he was saying resonated with her own feelings, with the connection she'd been trying so hard to deny. I'm terrified, she admitted. Not of you, but of hoping for something that could hurt us both so badly if it fails. I'm terrified too, Alexander said. But I'm more terrified of spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been if I'd been brave enough to try. He took her hand again, and this time Eliza didn't pull away. What would you say to an experiment? Nothing formal, nothing that commits us to anything permanent, but a chance to explore what this is between us, to see if it could work despite all the obstacles. An experiment, Eliza repeated. You want to experiment with courting me? I want to court you, period. The experimental part is seeing whether we can navigate the social complexities without destroying each other in the process. Alexander's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand. But only if you want this too, Eliza. I won't pressure you. If you tell me to stop, I will. But I need to know, do you want this? Do you want to see if we could make this work? Eliza looked at him. At this man who had somehow become essential to her in the space of a few weeks, who made her feel valued and seen in ways she'd never experienced. She thought about the life she'd imagined for herself before the accident, working in her father's forge, probably marrying eventually to some local tradesman, living a good but unremarkable life. And then she thought about the life Alexander was offering, uncertain, potentially scandalous, definitely complicated, but filled with possibility and connection and something that felt remarkably like love. Yes, she whispered, God help me, yes, I want to try. Alexander's smile was brilliant and relieved and full of promises she hoped he could keep. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that was courtly and intimate all at once. Then we'll try, he said, together, whatever comes. Whatever comes, Eliza agreed, and felt like she was stepping off a cliff with no idea whether she would fly or fall. But with Alexander beside her, she was willing to find out.
The weeks that followed were a strange dance of propriety and intimacy. Eliza's injuries healed slowly but surely, and as she grew stronger, Alexander insisted on taking her on carefully supervised outings. They drove through Hyde Park in his carriage, properly chaperoned by Mary and a footman, where fashionable society took their exercise. Heads turned as people recognized the Duke and speculated about his companion. Eliza heard the whispers, saw the stares, but Alexander ignored them with aristocratic indifference, pointing out landmarks and making wry observations about the people they passed. "That's Lady Pemberton," he murmured, as an overdressed matron stared particularly obviously. "She once tried to trap me into marriage by arranging to be found alone with me in a conservatory. Unfortunately for her, I'd been warned and brought 3 chaperones." "People do that?" Eliza asked, shocked. "Try to trap others into marriage?" "Constantly. An unmarried duke is considered fair game for every ambitious mother with an unmarried daughter." Alexander's expression was sardonic. "I've learned to be quite careful about where I go and who I'm alone with. Present company excepted, of course."
And what are they thinking now? About me? They're speculating wildly, I imagine. But let them. They'll know the truth soon enough. The truth. As if Alexander's intentions toward her could be reduced to something simple and explainable to society gossips. They also visited the British Museum, where Alexander delighted in showing her ancient artifacts and explaining their significance. Eliza found herself fascinated not just by the exhibits, but by watching Alexander talk about things he was passionate about, his usual reserved demeanor giving way to genuine enthusiasm. "You're beautiful when you're excited about something," she said without thinking, then immediately flushed at her own boldness. Alexander stopped mid-sentence about Greek pottery and turned to face her fully. "You think I'm beautiful?" "I think you're many things," Eliza said, trying to recover her composure. "Beautiful is just one of them. Name the others." It was almost a dare. "Intelligent, kind, stubborn as your aunt promised, surprisingly funny when you forget to be ducal, generous to a fault, and yes, objectively, physically beautiful in a way that probably made you quite insufferable as a young man." Alexander laughed, the sound echoing in the museum gallery. "I was insufferable as a young man. My aunt can tell you stories that would make you reconsider this entire courtship." "I doubt that," Eliza said softly. "I've already seen enough to know who you really are, Alexander. The past versions don't matter as much as the present one." He looked at her with such intensity that her breath caught. "You're remarkable, Eliza Hartley. Absolutely remarkable." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." They were in public, surrounded by other museum patrons, but the moment felt intimate and private, as though the rest of the world had faded to insignificance. It was Mary's gentle cough that reminded them where they were. But as they moved to the next exhibit, Alexander's hand brushed Eliza's, and she allowed herself to hope that perhaps, impossibly, they were building something real. The crisis came on a wet Tuesday evening when Eliza had been at Ashford House for 6 weeks. She was nearly fully healed, capable of walking unassisted, and ready to return home. The physician had cleared her for normal activities, and she knew her time in this strange bubble of possibility was coming to an end. Alexander found her in the library, where she'd been reading while trying not to think about leaving. "There you are," he said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply. "I need to talk to you about something important." Eliza set her book aside, dread pooling in her stomach. "That sounds ominous." "It's not ominous, it's just significant." Alexander sat beside her on the sofa, and she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Eliza, I've been making arrangements, quietly, through my aunt and some trusted advisors. I wanted to have everything in place before I spoke to you about it." "Arrangements for what?" "For us, for a future together." He took her hands in his. "I've spoken with your father. He's given his blessing, assuming you're willing.
I've also secured my aunt's commitment to sponsor you in society, to help smooth your entry into that world. And I've made financial arrangements that would ensure you're protected regardless of what happens. Eliza's heart was pounding. Alexander, what are you saying? I'm saying I want to marry you, Eliza, properly, publicly, with full acknowledgement of what that means and what we'll face together. His voice was steady, but his eyes were intense. I know we said this was an experiment, a trial to see if it could work, but I already know. I knew weeks ago. You're who I want, Eliza, not some appropriate society lady chosen for her connections and breeding. You, the woman who threw herself at runaway horses to save a stranger. The woman who argues with me about accepting gifts and challenges my assumptions and makes me want to be better than I am. You. Tears were streaming down Eliza's cheeks. I'm a blacksmith's daughter. You're extraordinary. Your father's profession is irrelevant to who you are as a person. Society won't see it that way. Society can go hang itself, Alexander said fiercely. I'm done living my life according to their arbitrary rules. I want you, Eliza. Will you marry me? Every logical reason to say no warred with the overwhelming desire to say yes. She thought about the scandal, the whispers, the difficulty of navigating a world she'd never been trained for. But she also thought about mornings talking with Alexander in the garden, afternoons exploring museums, evenings reading poetry together. She thought about how he looked at her as though she was precious, how he listened when she spoke, how he'd never once made her feel less than equal despite their difference in stations. Yes, she whispered. God help us both, yes. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she was something infinitely valuable. Thank you, he murmured against her hair. Thank you for being brave enough to try. I'm not brave, I'm terrified. You're the bravest person I know, Alexander said. You were brave when you saved my life, and you're brave now, agreeing to build a life with me despite all the obstacles. I promise you, Eliza, I'll spend every day making sure you never regret this choice. I already don't regret it, Eliza said, pulling back to look at him. I'm afraid, but I don't regret it. How is that possible? Because love doesn't make fear disappear. It just makes it worth facing. Alexander cupped her face in his hands. I love you, Eliza Hartley. I probably have since you woke up in my guest room and told me I was less pompous looking than expected. Eliza laughed through her tears. I love you too. Even though you're absolutely mad, and this is probably going to be the most complicated thing either of us ever does. Probably, Alexander agreed. Then he kissed her, gentle and reverent and full of promises they would spend their lives keeping. The wedding took place 3 months later in a small chapel on Alexander's country estate, with only close family and friends in attendance. Lady Margaret presided over the festivities like a benevolent general, ensuring everything went smoothly despite the raised eyebrows and whispered speculation from those few society members who'd been invited. Eliza wore a dress of ivory silk, simpler than a typical society wedding gown, but beautiful in its elegance. Her father walked her down the aisle with tears in his eyes and pride on his face. Alexander waited at the altar, looking more nervous than Eliza had ever seen him. The powerful Duke reduced to a man desperately hoping his bride wouldn't change her mind. But she didn't change her mind. She walked steadily forward, past the disapproving glances of distant relatives and the warm smiles of the few who genuinely supported them, until she stood beside Alexander and took his hands in hers. I, Alexander James Grayson, Duke of Ashford, he said, take you, Eliza Marie Hartley, to be my wife. I promise to honor you, protect you, and love you for all the days of my life. I promise to stand beside you against whatever challenges we face, to value your opinions and respect your choices, and to never take for granted the extraordinary gift of your love. Eliza's turn. I, Eliza Marie Hartley, take you, Alexander James Grayson, to be my husband. I promise to support you, challenge you when you need challenging, and love you with everything I am. I promise to face whatever comes with courage, to build a life with you that honors both where we came from and where we're going, and to never forget that you're the man who saw past a blacksmith's daughter to the person underneath. The vicar pronounced them married, and Alexander kissed her with a tenderness that made several wedding guests openly weep. The scandal, when it came, was every bit as intense as they'd expected. Society gossips had a field day with the Duke who'd married so far beneath his station. Invitations dried up, former friends distanced themselves. There were cut direct in public places and vicious cartoons in the scandal sheets. But there were also unexpected allies. Lady Margaret threw several dinner parties specifically to introduce Eliza to the more progressive members of society, people who cared more about character than breeding. Alexander's brother Richard and his wife proved to be staunch supporters, making it clear that anyone who wished to maintain connection with the future Duke would treat Eliza with respect. And gradually, painfully, a new equilibrium established itself. Eliza would never be fully accepted by the highest echelons of society, but she carved out her own place, involved in charitable work, patron of several organizations supporting working-class families, known for her intelligence and her refusal to be cowed by those who looked down on her origins. "How are you?" asked her one evening, a year into their marriage. They were in their private sitting room at Ashford House, and Eliza was reviewing correspondence from the charitable foundation she'd established to support children of laborers. "I'm good," she said, and meant it. Tired sometimes from battling society's snobbery, but good. "Any regrets?" His voice was carefully neutral, but she heard the fear beneath it, the worry that she might resent what their marriage had cost her. "None," Eliza said firmly. She moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. "It hasn't been easy. I won't pretend otherwise. There are days when the whispers and the snubs hurt, but then I come home to you, and I remember why we did this. I remember that choosing love, real, genuine love, is always worth whatever price society demands." Alexander pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I love you. More every day somehow." "I love you too." Eliza settled against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for being stubborn, for not giving up when it would have been easier. Thank you for being brave, for saying yes when you had every reason to say no." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had defied expectations and social conventions to build something rare and precious, a marriage based on genuine love and mutual respect rather than social advantage or obligation. Outside, London society continued its endless dance of propriety and pretense. But inside Ashford House, in that quiet sitting room, a duke and his blacksmith's daughter wife were simply happy. And that, they both agreed, was worth any scandal society could conjure. Epilogue. 5 years after the accident that changed everything, Eliza stood at the window of Ashford House's nursery, watching her 3-year-old son attempting to help his grandfather in the forge that Alexander had built on the estate specifically so Thomas Hartley could work closer to his family. "He's going to be covered in soot," Alexander said from the doorway, amusement clear in his voice. "Probably," Eliza agreed, "but he loves it, just like I did at his age." Alexander moved to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Our son, the future Duke of Ashford, learning blacksmithing from his common grandfather. Society must be absolutely scandalized. Society has been scandalized by us for years now. They're probably getting bored of it. One can hope." Alexander pressed a kiss to her neck. "Though I suspect the news we're about to share will give them something fresh to gossip about." Eliza's hand moved unconsciously to her still flat stomach. "You think they'll be horrible about it? About another child?"
They'll be horrible about everything, darling. That's what horrible people do. His hand covered hers on her stomach. But they'll also be forced to acknowledge that the Ashford line is secure, that our marriage is strong, and that love, scandalous, inappropriate, class-crossing love, has produced a thriving family. When did you become so philosophical? When I married a woman who taught me that happiness matters more than society's approval. Alexander turned her to face him. I mean it, Eliza. These 5 years with you have been the best of my life. You've made me better, as a husband, as a father, as a man. Whatever the gossips say, whatever difficulties we face, I wouldn't change a single thing. Not even the part where 10 horses showed up on your doorstep? Especially not that part. That was inspired brilliance, if I do say so myself. Eliza laughed and kissed him. This man who had somehow become her entire world. I love you, Alexander Grayson, my stubborn, brilliant, impossibly romantic Duke. I love you, Eliza Grayson, my brave, extraordinary, forever fascinating wife. Below, their son's delighted laughter drifted up from the forge. And in that moment, in that house, with that family, built on impossible choices and brave hearts and love that refused to be bound by convention, everything was exactly as it should be. Perfect, in all its scandalous, unconventional, absolutely beautiful glory.